From the very genesis of his political ascent, Adolf Hitler harbored an unyielding conviction. The Soviet Union, with its vast ideological chasm and immense territorial expanse, was destined to be the ultimate adversary of his Third Reich. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people watching aren't subscribed yet. His visceral abhorrence for communism, which he viewed as a corrosive force threatening the very fabric of European civilization, fueled a relentless ambition. Beyond mere ideological conquest, Hitler coveted the boundless plains and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia, the fertile agricultural lands of Ukraine, the rich mineral deposits, and critically, the immense oil reserves of the Caucasus. These, he believed, were the keys to Germany's long-term dominance, the Lebensraum, or living space, that would finally elevate the German people to their rightful place as the preeminent power on the continent, a master race unburdened by resource scarcity. This vision was not a fleeting thought, but a foundational pillar of his worldview, articulated in his earliest writings and speeches. Throughout the initial months of 1941, as the world held its breath, Hitler retreated to the serene yet strategically vital confines of the Berghof, his secluded mountain residence nestled amidst the majestic Bavarian Alps. Far from the clamor of Berlin, it was here, in this seemingly tranquil setting, that he meticulously orchestrated his most audacious and perilous gamble, Operation Barbarossa. This wasn't merely another military campaign. It was conceived as a titanic struggle for existence, an apocalyptic clash of civilizations that would either secure Germany's future for 1,000 years or lead to its utter ruin. The sheer scale of the undertaking was unprecedented. Steadily, almost imperceptibly to the outside world, his formidable armies, fresh from their triumphs in Western Europe, were systematically redeployed eastward. An immense logistical effort saw them re-equipped and retrained, not for the swift, decisive campaigns of the past, but for the brutal, protracted conflict that awaited them in the vast, unforgiving landscapes of the Soviet Union. Specialized winter gear, though ultimately insufficient, was considered, and new doctrines for fighting across immense distances were developed. In the intricate geopolitical dance of the time, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union technically remained Hitler's ally, bound by the non-aggression pact signed in 1939. Stalin, a master of political maneuvering, was acutely aware of his nation's profound vulnerabilities and was desperately keen to preserve this fragile peace. His country, despite its immense size and population, was woefully unprepared for a large-scale modern war. The industrialization drives of the 1930s had been impressive but uneven, and the military was still in a state of flux. The once feared Red Army, a colossal force that had, in theory, boasted the largest numbers and some of the most technologically advanced weaponry in the world, had been catastrophically crippled by Stalin's brutal purges. These waves of political repression, initiated in the late 1930s, had systematically targeted and eliminated vast swathes of its senior officer corps. An estimated 3/4 of its most experienced and capable commanders, from marshals to regimental leaders, had been either summarily executed or condemned to the brutal gulags, leaving a gaping void in leadership, tactical expertise, and institutional memory. The psychological impact on those who remained was equally devastating, fostering an atmosphere of fear, distrust, and stifled initiative. Beneath the veneer of a powerful, unified state, a profound collapse in both military morale and operational efficiency had taken root. The purges had not only removed skilled leaders, but had also instilled a pervasive culture of obedience over innovation, fear over critical thinking. As German military formations, with their ominous columns of tanks and infantry, began to flood into neighboring Poland, massing along the Soviet border, Stalin's paranoia and desperate desire to avoid any provocation reached fever pitch. He issued stringent directives, ordering his border commanders to undertake no action that could be construed as offensive or that might offend Hitler. This crippling self-restraint, born of a profound misreading of Hitler's intentions and an underestimation of the imminent threat, would prove to be a fatal strategic error, leaving Soviet forces dangerously exposed and unprepared for the storm about to break. Yet, before the full might of the Wehrmacht could be unleashed upon the Soviet Union, Hitler felt compelled to address a critical vulnerability: his southern flank. The nations of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, drawn by a combination of ideological affinity and strategic coercion, were already firm allies of Germany, providing vital resources and strategic depth. However, in March 1941, a sudden and unwelcome development occurred in Yugoslavia. The pro-German government, which had reluctantly aligned itself with the Axis powers, was abruptly overthrown by a popular uprising, fueled by strong pro-British and nationalist sentiments. This new, defiant regime posed an immediate threat to German supply lines and strategic interests in the region. Furthermore, Yugoslavia's neighbour, Greece, was also firmly aligned with Britain, hosting British expeditionary forces and offering a potential springboard for Allied operations. The prospect of a hostile Balkan front threatening the oil fields of Romania and the planned invasion routes was intolerable to Hitler. The stage was set for a swift, brutal campaign to secure the Balkans, a necessary prelude to the grander, more terrifying drama about to unfold in the east. But even as German forces swept through Yugoslavia and Greece, the clock was ticking, and the vast, frozen expanse of the Soviet Union loomed, a silent, formidable giant whose true strength remained an enigma. What secrets did this land hold, and how would it respond to the most massive invasion in human history? On April 6, 1941, the German war machine, with its characteristic precision and overwhelming force, launched its invasion of the Balkans. 33 German divisions, a formidable contingent of armor, infantry and air support, surged into Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav defenses, though bravely fought, were swiftly and brutally torn asunder by the coordinated blitzkrieg tactics. The capital, Belgrade, fell in a mere 6 days, surrendering on April 12th, a testament to the Wehrmacht's terrifying efficiency. Greece, despite receiving some assistance from British Commonwealth forces, succumbed almost as rapidly. Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks, and the British Expeditionary Force was forced into a desperate evacuation, reminiscent of Dunkirk. With the Balkans firmly under Axis control, Hitler's southern flank was secured, and the path was now clear for the monumental undertaking that was Operation Barbarossa. The logistical preparations were staggering. Over 4 million men, drawn from Germany and its Axis allies, were to be deployed across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. This colossal ground force was supported by more than 3,000 aircraft of the Luftwaffe, poised to dominate the skies. The strategic blueprint for Barbarossa called for 3 simultaneous massive thrusts, each with ambitious objectives. Army Group North was tasked with sweeping through the Baltic states, securing the vital port city of Leningrad, a symbolic and industrial heartland. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the 3, was assigned the most direct and critical objective: a relentless advance towards Moscow, the very heart of Soviet power. Finally, Army Group South was to conquer the fertile plains of Ukraine, seizing its rich agricultural resources and pushing towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. When Hitler unveiled this audacious plan to his senior generals, a palpable silence descended upon the room. Seasoned military minds, like Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and General Heinz Guderian, harbored profound reservations. They were deeply concerned that the plan was excessively ambitious, that it would dangerously overextend their forces, spreading them too thinly across an impossibly vast front. Yet, in the face of Hitler's unyielding conviction and the pervasive fear of dissenting, none dared to voice their profound doubts openly. The memory of previous campaigns, where Hitler's intuition had seemingly triumphed over conventional military wisdom, also played a role in their reluctant acquiescence. The Red Army, despite its internal weaknesses, was a force of immense numerical strength. It commanded nearly 2 million men, positioned within striking distance of the Western Front, with millions more held in reserve, ready to be mobilized from the depths of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the Soviets possessed an astonishing arsenal of over 20,000 tanks, a figure that dwarfed Germany's approximately 6,000. While many of these Soviet tanks were older models, less sophisticated and powerful than the cutting-edge German panzers, they still represented a formidable fighting force, capable of inflicting significant damage, especially in defensive roles. The critical question for the German High Command was whether their superior technology, tactical doctrine, and the sheer speed of their blitzkrieg could overwhelm and shatter the Soviet defenses before the Red Army's vast numerical superiority could be brought to bear. Grinding the German advance to a halt, it was a race against time, a gamble on the fundamental nature of modern warfare. Operation Barbarossa commenced with chilling precision at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. The initial phase was a massive artillery barrage along the entire front, followed by the thunderous roar of the Luftwaffe. At dawn, German aircraft swarmed across the border, targeting Soviet airfields in a devastating series of preemptive strikes. Within hours, thousands of Soviet aircraft, many still on the ground, were destroyed, effectively crippling the Red Air Force and granting the Luftwaffe almost total air superiority in the early stages of the invasion. Simultaneously, the ground assault began, a relentless tide of German armor and infantry. The Germans swiftly breached the River Bug, the natural boundary between occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, their panzers spearheading the advance. These armored spearheads, moving with astonishing speed, soon thrust deep into Soviet territory, exploiting weaknesses and creating chaos. Within a mere 2 days, the leading panzer units had penetrated more than 50 miles, a dizzying pace that left Soviet command structures reeling. Ill-coordinated and often suicidal Red Army counterattacks, launched without adequate preparation or unified command, were swiftly brushed aside by the disciplined and experienced German forces. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners, disoriented and demoralized, were rounded up in the initial days, a stark indicator of the Red Army's disarray. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe maintained absolute domination of the skies, providing crucial close air support for the ground troops and preventing any effective Soviet aerial reconnaissance or interdiction. The Soviet leadership, particularly Stalin, appeared to be paralyzed by the sheer scale and ferocity of the German onslaught. The initial shock of betrayal and the rapid collapse of their forward defenses left them stunned and unable to mount a coherent response. As the German panzers continued their relentless drive, encircling vast numbers of Soviet troops and capturing entire regions, the question loomed: could anything halt this seemingly unstoppable force? And what would be the fate of the Soviet Union, a nation caught utterly off guard by the betrayal of its supposed ally? On June 29th, a mere 7 days after the commencement of the assault, 2 formidable panzer thrusts executed a perfectly coordinated pincer movement near Minsk, the capital of Soviet Belarus. This maneuver resulted in the encirclement of colossal pockets of Soviet troops, a devastating blow to the Red Army's western defenses. As the follow-up infantry divisions arrived to consolidate the gains, an astonishing more than 300,000 prisoners of war were taken, a grim testament to the effectiveness of the German blitzkrieg and the disorganization of the Soviet resistance. In many areas, particularly within the newly annexed territories of Ukraine and the Baltic states, German soldiers were initially met not with hostility, but with a surprising degree of welcome. Anti-Russian sentiment, fueled by decades of Soviet oppression, forced collectivization, and the recent purges, was widespread. Many saw the Germans, however naively, as potential liberators from Stalin's brutal regime. This initial reception, though fleeting, added a complex layer to the early stages of the invasion. In Moscow, the news of the catastrophic losses and the rapid German advance plunged Joseph Stalin into a state of near-total collapse. The betrayal by Hitler, whom he had desperately tried to appease, seemed to shatter his iron will. For more than a week, the Soviet dictator remained in seclusion, silent and seemingly paralyzed by the unfolding disaster. It was not until July 3rd that he finally emerged, delivering a powerful, albeit delayed, radio address to his people. In a stark departure from his usual communist rhetoric, Stalin appealed directly to the deep-seated patriotism and national pride of the Russian people, invoking the spirit of Mother Russia to rally them against the invading forces. This shift from ideological to nationalistic fervor marked a crucial turning point in Soviet propaganda and galvanized a population facing existential threat. Meanwhile, in Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news of Operation Barbarossa with a very different, almost paradoxical mix of feelings. While the sheer brutality of the invasion was undeniable, it also meant that Britain, which had stood alone against Nazi Germany for over a year, finally had a powerful, albeit reluctant, ally. Churchill, ever the pragmatist, immediately recognized the strategic implications. He famously declared that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain, regardless of past political differences or ideological divides. He swiftly dispatched a mission to Moscow to forge a formal alliance, culminating in the signing of a treaty of mutual assistance with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. However, beyond sending vital aid by sea, which was a logistical nightmare, there was little Britain could do immediately to directly alleviate the immense pressure on the Soviet Union. The Western Allies were still reeling from their own defeats and were years away from mounting a significant second front. As June bled into July, the German blitzkrieg continued its relentless, terrifying slash deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. The speed and scale of the advance were breathtaking, leading many, both within Germany and among the Allies, to believe that nothing could possibly halt Hitler's war machine. The initial successes were so profound that it seemed the Soviet Union was on the verge of total collapse. Yet amidst this intoxicating rush of victory, Hitler was about to commit what would prove to be his first major strategic blunder, a decision that would reverberate throughout the entire campaign and ultimately contribute to its undoing. The seeds of doubt, initially suppressed by the euphoria of conquest, were beginning to sprout. In early July 1941, the German panzers had achieved another stunning encirclement, trapping over 300,000 Red Army troops west of Minsk. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of the panzer divisions, and his fellow armored commanders were desperate to maintain the momentum. They pleaded with Hitler to allow them to race on, to exploit the gaping holes in the Soviet defenses and drive directly for Moscow. Operation Barbarossa, despite its immense scale, was, in their eyes, working like a finely tuned clock. Within a week, Guderian's panzers had reached Smolensk, a strategically vital city deep inside Russia, placing them a mere couple of hundred miles from the Soviet capital. On July 22nd, another perfectly executed panzer pincer movement met to the east of Smolensk, ensnaring an additional 310,000 Soviet troops in yet another colossal pocket. The road to Moscow lay open, seemingly within grasp. But as the German war machine paused, however briefly, to consolidate its gains, A fateful decision from Hitler would divert its most potent spearheads, giving the battered Soviets a precious reprieve and perhaps a chance to turn the tide. What unforeseen consequences would this strategic shift unleash upon the Eastern Front? Following the massive encirclements at Smolensk, a brief but critical pause descended upon the German advance. While the panzer divisions, the cutting edge of the blitzkrieg, could move with spectacular speed, the vast majority of the German army still relied on the slower pace of infantry marching and the logistical limitations of horse-drawn transport. This meant that the main body of the army needed time to catch up, to consolidate the gains, and to mop up the hundreds of thousands of encircled Soviet soldiers. Even so, this consolidation phase took a mere 5 days before the infantry arrived, allowing the panzers to resume their advance. The entire operation, from encirclement to mopping up, was completed in just 9 more days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners, a tragic river of humanity, began their long, arduous trudge westward into captivity. Of the millions captured throughout the campaign, over 5 million would never return, succumbing to starvation, disease, or brutal treatment in German POW camps. Moscow, the ultimate prize, was now tantalizingly close, only 200 miles away, and the main road to it lay open. It seemed almost certain that the Soviet capital would fall by the end of the summer, precisely as Hitler had envisioned in his initial plans. However, elsewhere on the sprawling Eastern Front, the German advance was encountering increasingly stubborn and effective resistance. The Red Army, though battered, was beginning to learn, adapt and counterattack with greater ferocity. By mid-July, Army Group South, tasked with conquering Ukraine, was still more than 50 miles from Kiev, its primary objective in the region. Frustrated by this slower progress and increasingly obsessed with securing the rich resources of Ukraine and the Caucasus, Hitler made a pivotal and ultimately disastrous decision. He decreed that Guderian's panzers, the very spearhead poised to strike Moscow, should delay their advance on the capital and instead swing south to assist Army Group South in the capture of Kiev. Guderian, a brilliant operational commander, objected strenuously, arguing that diverting the panzers from their primary objective was a catastrophic error that would squander the momentum towards Moscow. But Hitler, convinced of his own strategic genius and increasingly distrustful of his generals, was adamant. There would be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. This decision, born of impatience and a shifting focus, would prove to be a fateful turning point, robbing the Germans of their best chance to seize the Soviet capital before the onset of the brutal Russian winter. There were already worrying signs that the Red Army was not the pushover Hitler had anticipated. Soviet manpower, despite the staggering losses, seemed endless, a seemingly inexhaustible reservoir of soldiers. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized across the vast Soviet Union, a testament to the nation's resilience and Stalin's ruthless efficiency in conscription. Furthermore, the Red Army was beginning to deploy formidable new weapons, most notably the T-34 tank. This 37-ton medium tank, armed with a powerful 76mm gun, was faster, more maneuverable, and possessed superior cross-country performance than the German Panzer Mark IV, which was the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored forces. Its sloped armor also made it incredibly difficult for German anti-tank guns to penetrate. The appearance of the T-34 on the battlefield was a rude awakening for German tank crews who had grown accustomed to technological superiority. Yet as the blitzkrieg continued its seemingly unstoppable momentum, it was easy for the German High Command to overlook these ominous warning signs. The sheer scale of their victories and the vast numbers of prisoners captured created a false sense of invincibility. Guderian's panzer group, reluctantly obeying Hitler's directive, began its thrust south on August 23, 1941, leaving the road to Moscow temporarily unguarded. 3 weeks later, the panzers of Army Group South, having fought their way north, met Guderian's forces east of Kiev on September 16th. This massive pincer movement resulted in the encirclement and utter destruction of 2 more Soviet armies, leading to the capture or killing of another 500,000 men. It was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic blunder. On the very same day, over 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North successfully surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, effectively cutting it off from the rest of the Soviet Union. With Leningrad besieged and Kiev fallen, Hitler's attention now swung back to Moscow. But the precious weeks lost had allowed the Soviets to regroup, and the first whispers of winter were already in the air. Would the German war machine, now stretched to its limits, be able to overcome the combined forces of a resurgent enemy and the unforgiving Russian climate? With Leningrad encircled, Hitler made a chilling decision. He opted not to storm the city, believing that a direct assault would be too costly in terms of German lives and resources. Instead, he ordered his troops to settle down and starve the city into surrender, a brutal strategy aimed at breaking the will of its inhabitants without direct combat. Conditions within Leningrad rapidly deteriorated into a nightmare. The city was almost entirely cut off, its only tenuous link to the rest of the Soviet Union being a perilous route across Lake Ladoga to the east. However, this road of life could only accommodate a trickle of supplies, utterly insufficient for the millions trapped within the city. Starvation quickly set in, becoming a silent, relentless killer. In November alone, over 11,000 people perished from hunger and cold. It wasn't until December, with the lake frozen solid, that an ice road could be established, allowing for a slight increase in rations. Yet even with this desperate measure, the death toll remained horrific. On one single day in December, 3,700 people succumbed to starvation. The siege of Leningrad would become one of the most prolonged and devastating in history, a testament to both human suffering and extraordinary resilience. Meanwhile, Army Group Center, now reinforced by Guderian's panzers returning from Kiev, prepared for the final decisive assault on Moscow. The Germans possessed a formidable numerical advantage, a 2.1 superiority in tanks and men at the front, and a staggering 3.1 advantage in aircraft. The stage was set for what Hitler believed would be the final act of Barbarossa. The assault commenced on September 30th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers, with their characteristic speed and ferocity, slashed deep through the Red Army's defensive lines, creating massive breaches and encircling more Soviet troops by October 7th. However, Stalin, having recovered from his initial paralysis, was now utterly determined to defend Moscow to the last man. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of his most capable and ruthless commanders, to organize the city's defense. Zhukov, a master of defensive warfare, immediately set about mobilizing every available resource. The entire population of Moscow, including women and children, was conscripted to dig a series of formidable defensive lines around the capital. Anti-tank ditches, barbed wire entanglements, and fortified positions were hastily constructed, transforming the city's approaches into a formidable obstacle course. But the most potent and ultimately decisive obstacle to the German advance would not be man-made fortifications. It would be the unforgiving Russian weather. On October 8th, heavy, incessant rains began to fall, transforming the unpaved Russian roads into impassable quagmires. German vehicles, designed for the hard roads of Western Europe, soon became hopelessly bogged down in a sea of mud. The Blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and mobility, ground to a halt. By late October, the appalling weather conditions, combined with an increasingly stubborn and well-organized Soviet resistance, meant that Army Group Center was still some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the steep price for his earlier decision to delay the advance on the capital. Around the same time, Army Group South, having secured Kiev, reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers and capturing another 100,000 prisoners. But they too were increasingly hampered by the deteriorating weather. Even so, the strategically important city of Kharkov was captured on October 24, 1941. However, the mud was now beginning to freeze and the temperatures plummeted. The German forces, confident that the campaign would be over by the summer, were caught woefully unprepared for the brutal Russian winter. Lacking adequate winter clothing, proper lubricants for their vehicles, and anti-freeze for their engines, they began to suffer terribly from frostbite, hypothermia, and equipment failures. The logistical nightmare of supplying an army stretched across thousands of miles in such conditions became almost insurmountable. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center, despite the immense hardships, launched a desperate final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December 4th, its leading units, exhausted and frostbitten, were just 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols even claimed to glimpse the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance, a tantalizing vision of victory. But that night, the temperature plunged again, reaching extreme lows. Tank engines, without proper winterization, refused to start. Weapons froze solid. Thousands of soldiers suffered severe frostbite, many losing limbs or their lives. On December 5th, the German advance, utterly broken by the elements and fierce Soviet resistance, finally halted. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army, granting them a reprieve that would prove invaluable. The Germans, however, remained confident that come the spring, they could finish the job. But what the Germans didn't know was that Stalin had a secret weapon, one that was already moving across the vast Siberian plains, poised to strike a devastating blow just as their offensive faltered. The tide was about to turn, not with a whimper, but with a savage roar. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the relentless German onslaught, suffering unimaginable losses. Yet throughout this period of profound crisis, the Soviet dictator harbored another deep-seated worry: the persistent threat of a Japanese attack on his forces in Siberia, which would force him to fight a devastating two-front war. However, in November, a crucial piece of intelligence arrived from his top spy in Japan, Richard Sorge, assuring him that the Japanese had no such intention, having instead decided to focus their expansionist ambitions southward towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This intelligence, a monumental strategic gift, allowed Stalin to make a daring and decisive move. Immediately, more than 30 battle-hardened divisions, comprising hundreds of thousands of well-equipped and highly trained troops, many of whom were accustomed to fighting in extreme winter conditions, began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway towards Moscow. By early December, over 500,000 extra men, fresh and ready for combat, were in position near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their frozen attempt to capture Moscow, these newly arrived Siberian divisions, along with other Soviet reserves, launched a savage and unexpected counterattack. First came a massive, thunderous Soviet artillery barrage, tearing through the exhausted and unprepared German lines. Then swarms of the formidable T-34 tanks, accompanied by assault infantry, crashed through the German defenses. The Germans, who had assumed the Red Army was on the ropes, were stunned by the ferocity and scale of this sudden offensive. Their morale, already brittle from the cold and the stalled advance, shattered. For the next 7 days, the Soviet troops tore into the German forces, pushing them back from the gates of Moscow. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, this was a terrible, humiliating blow. On December 19th, in a fit of rage and frustration, he sacked his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and, in an unprecedented move, assumed personal command of the German army himself. Heinz Guderian, The brilliant Panzer General was also dismissed, along with 35 other senior officers who had dared to voice doubts or advocate for tactical retreats. Hitler now issued an infamous order. There would be no more retreats. German troops were to fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. This draconian order, while causing immense suffering, did eventually help to stabilize the German line, preventing a complete rout. However, Stalin, elated by the Red Army's unexpected success, now demanded a massive, sweeping advance across the entire front, believing the Germans were on the verge of collapse. Marshal Zhukov, ever the pragmatist, tried to dissuade him, arguing for a more cautious, concentrated approach, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions, a brutal war of attrition in the frozen landscape. For Hitler, this was an incredibly uncomfortable and frustrating situation. He was accustomed to, and expected, quick, decisive results, the hallmark of the Blitzkrieg. Now he found himself dangerously bogged down in the vastness of the Soviet Union, facing an enemy that, despite immense losses, never seemed to give up. The war of movement had become a grinding war of attrition, a scenario for which the German army was ill-prepared, nor was Russia his only headache. On December 7, 1941, Germany's ally, Japan, launched a surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. Hitler, with almost no advance planning or strategic foresight, and driven by a misguided sense of loyalty to Japan and a profound underestimation of American industrial might, declared war on the United States just 4 days later. With this impulsive decision, he had taken on a massive new enemy, one with seemingly limitless resources, without any coherent strategy for fighting a global conflict. As 1941 transitioned into 1942, Hitler remained stubbornly determined to go on the offensive again in Russia. However, the catastrophic losses and the sheer scale of the Eastern Front meant that the original plan of fighting across the entire front was no longer tenable. Moreover, his economic advisors delivered grim news. Germany's vital oil supplies were running dangerously low, a critical vulnerability for a mechanized army. Faced with dwindling resources and a stalled offensive, Hitler was forced to devise a new strategy, one that would lead his armies not to Moscow, but to the sun-baked plains of southern Russia, towards a city that would become synonymous with unimaginable horror and a turning point in the war. What desperate gamble would he make next, and would it lead to victory or ruin? With the strategic landscape dramatically altered, Hitler decided to halt the attacks in the north and instead redirect the main thrust of his summer offensive towards Russia's vital oil fields in the south. This new campaign, codenamed Operation Blue, envisioned a massive assault south of Kharkov. Army Group A, the primary strike force, was to swing down through the Caucasus to seize the crucial oil fields of Maikop and Baku, while Army Group B was tasked with covering its flank along the Don River, protecting the main advance. The initial stages of Operation Blue were marked by brutal encounters. Soviet forces, attempting to retake Kharkov, clashed fiercely with the Germans, resulting in another devastating defeat for the Red Army. Over 200,000 Soviet troops were captured, and an estimated 70,000 were killed, highlighting the continued effectiveness of German tactical prowess. As part of this broader southern offensive, the Germans also tightened their relentless siege of the port of Sevastopol in the Crimea. For 8 grueling months, the city's defenders had endured a constant, pulverizing bombardment from German artillery, including the terrifying Dora, a massive 800mm railway gun, and other heavy siege weapons. In late June 1942, after an epic struggle, Sevastopol finally fell to the Germans, securing the Crimean Peninsula and freeing up vital forces for the push eastward. With Sevastopol secured, the path to the oil fields seemed clear. On June 28th, the main offensive of Operation Blue began. Army Group B, encountering less resistance, forced its way through to the Don River and advanced rapidly along its western bank. Army Group A, facing stronger Soviet resistance in the initial stages, still made significant progress, and by July 9th it was close to Rostov, a key gateway to the Caucasus. It was at this critical juncture that Hitler began to make a series of what would prove to be catastrophic strategic blunders, driven by his increasing impatience and a dangerous overconfidence. As Army Group B made its way along the Don, the Führer, without consulting his generals, issued a new, bewildering order. It was to capture Stalingrad. This city, though bearing the name of his arch-enemy, had no immediate strategic significance to the primary objective of seizing the oil fields. It was an industrial center on the Volga, but its capture was a diversion from the main goal. Suddenly a massive new task, one that would drain immense resources, was thrust upon an army already stretched thin. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his misjudgment. Frustrated by the perceived slow progress of Army Group A in the Caucasus, he diverted the bulk of its panzers, the very spearhead meant for the oil fields, southward into the mountains. This decision critically weakened the main thrust towards the oil, and the march on Stalingrad, now a secondary objective, slowed noticeably. The reinforced Army Group A, now with its panzers back, raced across the Caucasus, reaching within 70 miles of the Caspian Sea, threatening to cut off all the Soviet armies in the area and seize the vital oil fields. But then, in another display of his erratic decision-making, Hitler changed his mind yet again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress towards Stalingrad, he now ordered the panzers from Army Group A to turn around and race back north to assist in the assault on the city. On August 9th, Army Group A did manage to seize the first of the southern oil fields at Maikop, but they found them comprehensively trashed by the retreating Soviets. Without the necessary reinforcements, which had been diverted, Army Group A could advance no further, and the truly vast oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained tantalizingly beyond its grasp. By now, however, Hitler's attention had shifted entirely. In late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, which bore the name of Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun. It would become one of the most brutal, prolonged, and ultimately decisive battles of World War II, a crucible of human suffering and military folly. The stage was set for an urban nightmare, a battle that would redefine the meaning of warfare. But as General Paulus's Sixth Army closed in on Stalingrad, little did they know that the city, seemingly an easy target, was about to become a meat grinder, a trap from which few would ever escape. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's formidable Sixth Army, the spearhead of the German advance, crossed the Don River and began its final relentless push towards Stalingrad. 6 days later, one panzer thrust, moving with terrifying speed, reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were already fighting in the outer suburbs. Hitler, observing the rapid progress, seemed poised for a famous symbolic victory. Stalingrad was more than just a city. It was a crucial industrial center, stretching for over 12 miles along the west bank of the mighty Volga River. Its factories were vital to the Soviet war effort, producing over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors and trucks, as well as significant numbers of tanks and artillery pieces. The Volga itself was a critical artery for transporting oil from the Caucasus to the rest of Russia. However, the Russian people, under Stalin's unwavering command, had transformed Stalingrad into a formidable fortress. They had been inadvertently aided by Hitler's earlier decision to divert Army Group B's panzers to the south, a delay that had granted them an invaluable 2 weeks to prepare their defenses. Every building, every street, every factory was fortified, turning the city into a labyrinth of resistance. Now began one of the most prolonged, intense, and utterly savage battles of World War II. Slowly, agonizingly, the Germans edged forward, street by street, house by house, Stuka dive bombers, the terrifying harbingers of the Blitzkrieg, blitzed just ahead of them, turning entire blocks into rubble. The fighting was brutal, a close-quarters nightmare. House to house, room by room, cellar to cellar, the battle raged with an intensity rarely seen before. The Soviet defenders, often fighting to the last man, utilized the city's extensive sewer systems for shelter, communication, and surprise attacks. The ruins above, a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted metal, became ideal positions for snipers, who exacted a heavy toll on the advancing Germans. Russian reinforcements, often raw recruits, had to be ferried across the treacherous Volga River under constant assault from the Luftwaffe. Yet despite the immense dangers, thousands managed to get through, replenishing the depleted ranks of the defenders. By late September, the Germans had pushed their way through most of the city, almost reaching the Volga, a mere few hundred yards from their ultimate objective. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad had become an absolute obsession, a matter of personal prestige and symbolic victory over his ideological foe. On October 4, 1942, General Paulus launched what was intended to be the final decisive assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, grinding over the rubble, firing point-blank into courtyards and shattered buildings. One German officer grimly remarked, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters, a chilling testament to the horrific cost of the urban warfare." German victory seemed certain. The Volga was almost within reach. But in reality, the Germans were dangerously overextended. Their supply lines stretched to breaking point, their troops exhausted and demoralized by the relentless fighting. Unbeknownst to them, the Soviet army was secretly bringing in massive reinforcements. By mid-November, over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft had been secretly moved to the battle zone, meticulously concealed from German reconnaissance. The trap was set. On November 19th, the Soviets unleashed their fury, not on the city itself, but on the unsuspecting flanks of the German Sixth Army, a move that would seal their fate and turn the tide of the entire Eastern Front. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet forces, under the brilliant operational command of Marshal Zhukov, launched Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that struck the Germans' northern flank, held primarily by poorly equipped Romanian and Hungarian units. After a thunderous hours-long artillery barrage that pulverized the Axis lines, waves of T-34 tanks and elite assault infantry burst through the shattered positions. The Axis troops, stunned by the savagery of the attack and utterly unprepared, surrendered in their thousands, their defenses crumbling. The next day, a similar Soviet assault in the south, targeting other Axis-allied forces, was equally successful. The two Soviet pincer movements, moving with astonishing speed, met west of Stalingrad on November 23rd, effectively cutting off and encircling the entire German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army and various Axis-allied units, numbering approximately 300,000 men. General Paulus, in charge of the trapped German forces, could have attempted a desperate breakout, a maneuver that might have saved a significant portion of his army. However, Hitler, blinded by his obsession with Stalingrad and convinced that the city could not be abandoned, issued a direct order. Paulus was to stand and fight. The Führer had been assured by Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, that sufficient supplies could be airlifted into Stalingrad to sustain the encircled forces. This false promise was enough for Hitler to announce that the German positions must hold out until relieved. To aid Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the overall German commander in the region, launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12th. It was a desperate attempt by German panzers to break through the Soviet encirclement and relieve the trapped Sixth Army. For 2 days, Manstein's forces made promising progress, pushing through the Soviet lines. But then, Red Army resistance stiffened dramatically, and the weather conditions with heavy snow and blizzards worsened considerably. By December 23rd, the German rescue attempt had ground to a halt, agonizingly close yet impossibly far, about 30 miles from the city. Manstein, recognizing the futility of further attempts and the dire situation of the Sixth Army, advised the beleaguered Paulus to attempt a breakout even against Hitler's orders. But Paulus, a loyal but indecisive commander, wanted Hitler's explicit permission, which was, predictably, refused. It was probably too late anyway. The Sixth Army was already too weak and too low on fuel to execute a successful breakout. Marshal Zhukov, now fully in control of the strategic initiative, unleashed the next stage of his master plan, a massive assault on Manstein's panzer relief operation. The German panzers were pushed back, away from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had vanished. Worse still, the promised airlift of supplies into the city proved to be a catastrophic fiasco. The German troops needed an estimated 700 tons of supplies per day to survive, but they never received more than 80 tons on even the best days. The weather was too bad, the distances too great, and the Red Air Force, having regained air superiority, now commanded the skies over Stalingrad, shooting down German transport planes with alarming regularity. Steadily, relentlessly, the Soviet troops squeezed in on the encircled Germans, tightening the noose. Approximately 200,000 men were trapped, freezing and starving. On January 8th, the Soviets issued an ultimatum, calling on the Germans to surrender, promising humane treatment. They refused, still clinging to Hitler's impossible orders. The end was inevitable, but the suffering was far from over. What would be the final, agonizing moments of the Sixth Army, and what would this catastrophic defeat mean for the future of the Third Reich? The final days of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad were a descent into hell. Starvation, disease, and the relentless cold claimed thousands of lives daily. Ammunition dwindled, medical supplies ran out, and the once proud soldiers were reduced to desperate, frost-bitten shadows. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler just hours before, in a cynical attempt to prevent his surrender, no German field marshal had ever surrendered, was finally forced to capitulate. Over 100,000 men, a fraction of the original force, stumbled off into Soviet captivity, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed. Of these, a staggering number would never return to Germany. Only about 5,000 would ever see their homeland again, many years later, after enduring unimaginable hardships in Soviet prison camps. Stalingrad had been a bloody, apocalyptic battle, a turning point of immense historical significance. The Germans had been savaged, losing some 300,000 of their own men, along with at least as many from their Axis allies. The human cost for the Soviets was equally, if not more, horrific, with approximately the same number of military casualties, in addition to tens of thousands of civilians who perished in the fighting and siege. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far, a defeat that shattered the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East. But it wouldn't be the last. The Red Army, emboldened by its triumph, was now inflicting massive defeats on Hitler's forces across the entire Eastern Front, seizing the strategic initiative. Stalingrad had been a monumental triumph for the Soviet army, a testament to their resilience and Zhukov's strategic brilliance. Now, its operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, set his sights on Germany's Army Group A, still precariously camped in the Caucasus, its primary objective of seizing the oil fields unfulfilled. Soviet troops thrust their way west of Stalingrad, and by early December 1942, they were within 120 miles of Rostov, a critical choke point. There was a very real possibility that all the German forces in the south, including Army Group A, would be cut off and encircled, mirroring the fate of the Sixth Army. Faced with this dire threat, Hitler, with immense reluctance, finally gave Army Group A permission to fall back. Over the next month, the Germans fought a skillful and desperate rearguard action, withdrawing hundreds of thousands of troops under immense pressure, preventing another catastrophic encirclement. Then, on January 12, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out assault, a massive winter offensive across a 500-mile front. Outnumbered 7-1, von Manstein, the overall commander of the German forces in the region, orchestrated a brilliant mobile retreat, using delaying tactics and counterattacks to prevent his forces from being annihilated. But by the end of February, the relentless Red Army had recaptured both Kursk and the nearby city of Kharkov, pushing the Germans back hundreds of miles. This Russian winter offensive had struck a crippling blow to German power. Over a matter of months, the Wehrmacht had lost an estimated 1 million men, along with vast numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, and other vital equipment. The Red Army, in contrast, still possessed enormous reserves of manpower, a seemingly endless supply of soldiers. It was also benefiting from a huge increase in domestic weapons production and crucial aid from the United States and Britain through the Lend-Lease program, which provided trucks, raw materials, and other essential supplies. The Germans also no longer held the technological upper hand they had enjoyed in 1941. The T-34 tank, with its superior armor and firepower, was more than a match for the Panzer IV, forcing the Germans to rapidly develop new, heavier tanks. The Soviets also deployed the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket launcher system, dubbed Stalin's organs by the Germans, which shattered German troop formations with its devastating barrages. Yet despite these immense setbacks, Hitler refused to give up hope. He still dreamed of a preemptive summer assault that would throw the Soviet Union off balance and regain the initiative. The city of Kursk, where the Soviet advance had created a massive bulge deep into the German lines, seemed the obvious place to strike. It looked temptingly exposed, a perfect target for a pincer movement to cut off and annihilate a large portion of the Red Army. Hitler also had an ace up his sleeve. A new generation of German tanks designed specifically to combat the formidable T-34. But would these new machines be enough to turn the tide? Or would Kursk become another graveyard for German ambitions? Hitler's grand plan for the summer of 1943 centered on the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the German lines created by the Soviet winter offensive. He envisioned a colossal pincer movement, with German forces attacking from the north and south of the salient, meeting in the center to encircle and destroy a significant portion of the Red Army. This, he believed, would regain the strategic initiative and inflict a devastating blow on the Soviets. To achieve this, he pinned his hopes on a new generation of German tanks, specially designed to counter the formidable Russian T-34. These were the massive but slow 55-ton Tiger Wing, armed with a lethal 80-mm gun, whose frontal armor made it almost impervious to most Soviet tank guns at standard combat ranges. Alongside it was the faster, more agile 43-ton Panther, featuring a new 75-mm gun, also capable of knocking out a T-34. These tanks were so new and their production so complex that Hitler was forced to delay the attack for several weeks, waiting for sufficient numbers to be manufactured and delivered to the front. This delay, however, would prove to be a critical error, even as the German forces, including these new armored behemoths, began to assemble for the offensive. The Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, a master of intelligence and defensive strategy, correctly guessed what was about to happen. His suspicions were soon confirmed by vital information received from a Soviet spy operating deep within the German High Command. This intelligence not only confirmed the German intentions, but also pinpointed the exact location and approximate timing of the attack. Armed with this crucial knowledge, Zhukov immediately ordered the construction of an unprecedented series of defensive lines around the Kursk salient. These were not mere trenches, but a multi-layered, deeply echeloned system of anti-tank ditches, vast minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire designed to absorb and break the German armored thrusts. He also massively built up Soviet forces in the area, pulling in troops and tanks from less vulnerable sectors of the front, creating a formidable defensive force. By the eve of the German assault on Kursk, the Soviets had achieved an overwhelming numerical superiority. The Germans were hugely outnumbered by the Soviet defenders, who also possessed the invaluable advantage of knowing precisely when and where the Germans would attack. On July 5, 1943, just as the German troops were preparing to launch their offensive, they were hit by a massive, preemptive Soviet artillery bombardment. This devastating barrage, launched hours before the German attack, disrupted their formations, destroyed equipment, and shattered morale, further delaying and weakening their initial push. Even so, the next morning, the panzers, including the new Tigers and Panthers, still rolled forward, a terrifying sight. But this time, they were not facing a disorganized, retreating enemy. They were up against a well-entrenched, prepared, and numerically superior foe, fighting from meticulously constructed defensive positions. There was no realistic chance of a lightning blitzkrieg breakthrough. The results of the initial German attacks were disastrous. In the northern sector of the salient, the German army gained a mere 6 miles for the staggering loss of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans fared a little better, managing to drive a wedge approximately 25 miles deep into the Soviet defenses. But this limited success also came at an incredibly high price. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks were destroyed. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as if a German breakthrough might still be possible in the southern sector. But then, Zhukov, holding his reserves in readiness, unleashed his counterstroke. On July 12, 1943, in the Prokhorovka sector, 900 Soviet tanks charged into the German flank, initiating what would become the largest armored battle in history. Almost 2,000 tanks, a thunderous clash of steel and fire, engaged in a brutal, close-quarters melee. The fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, was a cataclysmic clash of armored titans, a spectacle of unprecedented scale and ferocity. Almost 2,000 tanks, German panzers including the new Tigers and Panthers, against Soviet T-34s and other armored vehicles, engaged in what remains the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34s, often operating in massed formations, drove directly into the German lines, closing the distance to negate the superior range and armor of the German heavy tanks. They opened fire at point-blank range, turning the battlefield into a maelstrom of explosions, burning metal, and shattered machinery. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and utterly merciless. After a single day of savage combat, the Germans had lost a further 350 tanks and were forced to retreat, their offensive momentum utterly broken. Meanwhile, overhead, an epic air battle raged as the Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force, VVS, vied for supremacy. Initially, the Luftwaffe, with its experienced pilots, held an advantage, but the sheer numbers and increasing quality of Soviet aircraft, combined with improved tactics, gradually allowed the VVS to establish air superiority. This was a critical development, as it allowed the Russians to unleash their formidable Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, known as flying tanks, or tank killers, which wreaked havoc on German armored columns and troop concentrations. By July 23rd, the Germans had lost any ground they had gained in the Kursk offensive, and with it, the cream of their armored forces and many of their most experienced troops. Hitler's ill-fated adventure at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops killed, wounded or missing, and more than 700 tanks destroyed or severely damaged. The Battle of Kursk marked a definitive turning point on the Eastern Front. Never again would the Germans be able to launch a major strategic offensive against the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the initiative firmly belonged to the Red Army. The Russians had not merely halted a German offensive, they had decisively turned the tide of the war in the East. The strategic balance had shifted irrevocably. The German war machine, once seemingly invincible, was now on the defensive, forced into a long, grinding retreat that would ultimately lead to Berlin. The human cost of this titanic struggle was immense, but the resilience, sacrifice, and sheer industrial might of the Soviet Union, combined with the strategic blunders of Hitler, had ultimately prevailed. The road to victory would still be long and bloody, but after Kursk, the direction was clear. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people watching aren't subscribed yet.